My name is Samantha Williams. And if someone had told me that my father's wedding would become the day I stopped being invisible, I would have laughed. At 29, I had made peace with being the daughter who disappointed him, or at least, I thought I had. But life has a way of forcing truth into the light. No matter how long someone tries to hide it under the glow of chandeliers and money, for years, my father, Richard Williams, treated status like oxygen. He couldn't breathe without it. He was the kind of man who believed success was measured by the square footage of your home and the title under your name. To him, image wasn't just important, it was everything. And I never quite fit into that picture. When I joined the Army at 18, he said it was a waste of potential. When I built a career in private security, he called it a phase. When I earned promotions and commendations, he smiled politely, like someone tolerating a child's hobby. You could have been anything. Head Sieg. But instead, you're a security guard. The way he said those words flat, dismissive, was like a door closing that I never managed to reopen. My parents divorced when I was 12. My mother, Audrey, a gentle kindergarten teacher, had finally grown tired of being alone while still married. She left the penthouse and the designer furniture behind, taking only her dignity and me. We moved into a modest apartment with creaky floors and mismatched dishes. But it was peaceful. She always said, "Love doesn't need luxury. It needs attention." My father never understood that, after the divorce, weekends with Dad were like entering a foreign country, polished marble floors, cold air conditioning, and silence that echoed off every expensive surface. He'd plan our time down to the minute brunch at the country club, a quick stop at his office, a casual dinner with his colleagues where I was expected to smile, answer question politely, and never mention my mother. Even as a teenager, I could sense his disappointment in me, in my soft-spoken nature, in my awkwardness, in my preference for books over parties. He was grooming me for a future I never wanted. Law school, corporate partnerships, a husband who looked good in photographs. The life he wanted me to live was a script I could never memorize. So, at 18, instead of following his plan, I walked into an Army recruitment office. I can still remember the look on his face when I told him. He laughed, not because it was funny, but because disbelief was easier than anger. "The Army," he'd said. "You're joking. You wouldn't last a week." But I did. I lasted 4 years through training, deployments, sleepless nights, and the kind of self-discipline that burns arrogance right out of you. I came home, changed, sharper, stronger, no longer seeking approval from a man who would never give it. That should have been enough to earn his respect. But when I told him I was joining Meridian Protection Services, one of the top private security firms in the country, he gave that tight smile of his and said, "Well, at least it's respectable enough." I suppose it was never enough. Not the degree in criminal justice I earned while working nights. Not the promotions. Not the commendation letters. In his world, I would always be the daughter who didn't live up to the name. Then came the invitation cream cardstock. Gold embossed lettering. The kind of thing that screams wealth for the sake of it. "Richard Williams and Eleanor Harrington request the honor of your presence." Eleanor was wife number 3, a socialite with impeccable posture and a smile that could slice marble. I had met her once, briefly, at a charity event years ago. She had looked me up and down and said, "Oh, you're the daughter from the first marriage. How nice." The way she said nice made it sound like an insult wrapped in satin. I almost threw the invitation away, but my best friend Alicia stopped me. "You should go," she said. "Not for him. For you. Walk in there proud. Let them choke on their judgments." And maybe some part of me still wanted him to see me to finally say, "I'm proud of you, Sam." So I went. The venue was ridiculous. The Rosewood Resort. A coastal palace, surrounded by manicured gardens and luxury cars that probably cost more than my apartment building. When I walked into the marble lobby, The air smelled of money and expensive perfume. "Samantha," my father said, appearing with Eleanor on his arm. He looked sharp in his custom-tailored tuxedo, his silver cufflinks glinting in the light. "You made it." A kiss on the cheek, quick. "Cold." Eleanor smiled thinly. "So glad you could join us." "Dear," she said, eyes already drifting past me toward the arriving guests. "The rehearsal dinner's at 6. Do try to be on time." They swept away, leaving me standing there like furniture. Someone forgot to move. Dinner that evening was a portrait of social hierarchy, polished laughter. Champagne glasses clinking. Name-dropping disguised as conversation. I was seated at the far end of the room, far from the head table where my father sat among senators, bankers, and the kind of people who wear success like a uniform halfway through dinner. My father appeared beside me, smiling as he introduced me to an older couple. "This is my daughter, Samantha," he said. "She's a security guard." He didn't say I managed a national security team, or that I specialized in threat assessment. Just security guard. The woman smiled politely, struggling to find a compliment. "Oh, how interesting," she said. Her husband added, "Well, thank you for your service." As though that closed the subject. My father was already moving on to someone more important. I felt my face heat, but I kept my expression neutral. I'd learned long ago that composure is the best revenge. Still, his words stung like paper cuts. Each introduction that night was the same. "This is my daughter. She's a security guard." Each time, my chest tightened a little more. By dessert, I'd stopped listening to conversations around me. I texted Alicia under the table. "Me. He's doing it again. Just a security guard." Alicia let him. "Tomorrow. To be the woman. You are not the label he gives you." Her words stayed with me. I clung to them like armor. The next morning, the sun rose bright and unforgiving over the ocean. The ceremony was scheduled for 4. I spent the day walking the beach, watching waves erase footprints, wondering if life could do the same to old wounds. By 3:30, the guests began to gather in the garden rows of white chairs, roses everywhere, and an orchestra playing soft classical music. I chose a seat in the back, where I could disappear quietly after the vows. But fate had other plans. As the crowd settled, something caught my attention, a catering staff member near the bar. His movements just slightly off. His uniform didn't fit right. His posture wasn't that of a server, too rigid, too alert. His eyes scanned the crowd not like someone serving champagne, but like someone scanning targets. My instincts stirred. Years of training told me what my mind didn't want to believe: this wasn't right. At first, I tried to dismiss it. Maybe I was imagining things. But then I noticed 2 more staff members exchanging subtle hand signals, barely perceptible, but coordinated. They weren't pouring drinks. They were preparing for something. My pulse quickened. I scanned for exits. Crowd density. Potential choke points. My brain switching into assessment mode without conscious thought. A catering door closed behind one of them. I waited 3 beats, then followed quietly, casually, as though looking for the restroom. The service corridor was empty, except for distant kitchen noise. I saw the man duck into a storage room. I moved closer, just in time to hear muffled voices through the thin door. 4 more coming through the east entrance. After the vows during the toast, rich pickings tonight. 2 million in jewelry easy. My blood ran cold. I backed away. Heart pounding. 7 suspects. Coordinated timing. Weapons likely concealed. My father's wedding, his obsession with wealth and status, had just become the perfect target, and I was the only one who knew. I moved fast, but every step felt like I was walking through water. The music outside drifted faintly through the corridor, a slow, delicate melody, completely at odds with the dread pooling in my stomach. The rational part of me wanted to believe there was still time, that the situation could be contained before anyone realized what was about to happen. But the part of me that had spent years reading threat patterns knew better. I called the local police first, keeping my voice low. This is Samantha Williams. I'm a licensed security professional with Meridian Protection Services. I'm attending a private wedding event at the Rosewood Resort, and I've identified what I believe to be an active, coordinated robbery in progress. Multiple armed suspects posing as catering staff. Estimated 7 in total. You'll need to send armed units discreetly fast. The dispatcher promised officers were en route. I hung up, exhaled shakily, then made my way to the small security room tucked behind the lobby offices. Inside, a single guard sat half asleep in front of the camera monitors, one hand in a bag of chips. His name tag read Carl. "Excuse me," I said, flashing my company ID. "There's a credible security threat to the Williams-Harrington wedding. I need your supervisor now." He blinked at me, startled, then picked up his radio. Within minutes, the head of resort security arrived, Michael Jenkins. Mid-40 seconds. Clean cut. With the weary confidence of a man who had handled too many false alarms. "Miss Williams," he greeted. "Carl said you reported something suspicious." I didn't waste time. 3 imposters in catering uniforms. Possibly armed. I overheard them planning to strike during the reception. They mentioned 4 more arriving through the east entrance. I've already alerted local law enforcement. ETA for backup, 15 to 20 minutes. You need to lock down the service entrances and position your team by the exits. To his credit, Jenkins didn't argue. "We'll move," he said, grabbing his radio. Within seconds, his voice was echoing through the network. "All units possible 1033 inches progress. Lock down east access. Double coverage at the perimeter. Stay discreet." I left the room, pulse hammering, and slipped back toward the ceremony. The crowd was already seated. The orchestra swelled, violins blending into a soft romantic haze as Eleanor appeared at the end of the aisle in a gown that sparkled like frost. My father, standing at the altar, looked radiant, like a man whose entire world was finally in order. Watching him beam like that, I felt something twist inside me. He didn't see me as I was. He never had. And now, without knowing it, he was standing at the center of a threat. I might have to ruin his perfect day to stop. As the vows began, I positioned myself near the back, keeping the suspects in my peripheral vision. 2 had drifted near the gift table, another lingered by the bar. They moved with that deceptive calm I'd seen before, the kind that precedes chaos. I texted Jenkins updates in short bursts. When the officiant pronounced, "You may kiss the bride," applause erupted. My father turned to face the guests, grinning wide. While servers began circulating with champagne flutes, the suspects adjusted their earpieces. Something in the air shifted a quiet tension, almost electric. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice. A deliberate signal. My heart dropped. The man near the bar reached into his jacket. "Gun," I shouted, diving for cover as a single shot blasted into the ceiling. Screams erupted. The sound ripped through the air, sharp and final, shattering every illusion of safety. "Nobody move," the gunman yelled. "Hands up jewelry. Watches empty your pockets. Do it now and nobody gets hurt." Panic rolled through the crowd. Guests ducked under tables. The orchestra scattered, instruments clattering against the floor. My father pulled Eleanor behind the altar, shielding her as best he could. I counted 7 of them just as I'd overheard. 3, with guns drawn. 4, collecting valuables. They moved fast. Efficient. Trained. Someone had done this before. My mind clicked into tactical focus. 7 armed suspects. 30 plus civilians. Minimal cover. Police minutes away. If I acted recklessly, people would die. If I waited too long, someone might die anyway. A scream drew my attention, an elderly woman clutching her chest, gasping for air. One of the robbers snarled, shut her up, and aimed his gun at her trembling form. Without thinking, I rose from behind a fallen chair. "I'm a medic," I lied. "She's having a cardiac episode. Let me help her. You don't want a death on your hands that changes everything." The gunman hesitated, confused by the calm in my voice. "Make it quick," he snapped. I knelt beside the woman, guiding her breathing, positioning myself between her and the robber. "It's okay," I whispered. "Help's coming. Stay low." Through the window behind her, flashing blue lights flickered in the distance. Police. Finally. The robbers hadn't noticed yet. They were too busy stripping guests of watches and wallets. The leader, broad-shouldered, mask half raised, was now confronting my father directly. "You, the rich one, hand over the safe code for the bridal suite." I don't know it," my father stammered. "Ask the hotel manager." "No phones." The man barked, pressing his gun against my father's temple. Eleanor sobbed quietly beside him. Something inside me snapped. For years, I'd tried to make that man proud. Now I was about to save him, whether he deserved it or not. I caught Jenkins's eye across the room. He had his team positioned, waiting for my signal. "There's a master list of access codes at the front desk." I called out, loud enough for the leader to hear. "I can get it for you." The man turned, narrowing his eyes. "You work here. Security," I said evenly. "I know the system. Let me help you before the police get here." He stepped closer, suspicion flickering into opportunity. That was my moment. As he reached out to grab my arm, I pivoted, grabbing his wrist, twisting sharply, driving my elbow into his solar plexus. His gun flew from his hand as he gasped for air. I caught it mid-fall, turning the weapon outward just as his accomplice raised his own. A shot rang out. Heat seared through my upper arm, but adrenaline drowned the pain. I ducked behind the nearest table, dragging the disarmed leader with me as cover. Now I yelled. Jenkins's team surged forward. 2 undercover police officers disguised as guests drew their weapons simultaneously. Gunfire exploded across the hall, deafening and chaotic. Cries of panic filled the air. When the smoke began to clear, 5 suspects were already subdued. 2 fled toward the kitchen, one grabbing a terrified server as hostage. Ignoring the throbbing in my arm, I pushed through the chaos, following the sound of shouting into the service corridor. I found them by the loading dock, the gunman gripping the young woman by the throat. "Stay back," he screamed. "I'll kill her." I raised my voice, calm and steady. "You're surrounded. The police are here. Drop the weapon and you walk out alive." He shook his head, desperation trembling in his hands. "You don't understand." "I do," I said softly, stepping closer. "You're scared, but this is over. Let her go." For a heartbeat. He hesitated. That heartbeat was all I needed. I lunged, knocking his wrist aside, sending the gun clattering to the floor. 1 clean strike to his ribs, another to his jaw, and he was down. By the time the police rushed in, my arm was bleeding freely, the pain now impossible to ignore. "Ma'am, you need medical attention," an officer said. "Check the reception hall first," I replied, pressing a towel against my wound. "There's an elderly woman, she needs help." When I finally returned to the garden, the scene was unrecognizable. Tables overturned, glass shattered, guests huddled under blankets as paramedics moved among them. My father stood near the altar, face pale, Eleanor clinging to his arm. He saw me, his expression somewhere between shock and disbelief. "Samantha, you're hurt." "It's just a graze," I said. "Are you both okay?" He nodded wordlessly. Around us, people were whispering. Someone said, "That's Richard's daughter. Did you see what she did?" I didn't reply. I just sat down on the nearest chair, the sound of sirens still echoing in the distance, wondering if anything at all would ever be the same again. Morning settled like a bruise over the resort, purple and tender at the edges. I woke to a tightness in my arm and a flood of notifications that lit my phone like a strobe. For a few bewildered seconds, I didn't know if the sirens were memory or present tense. Then the ache sharpened, and with it came fragments of the night before the gun scraping my father's temple. Eleanor's strangled breath, the metallic bite of adrenaline on my tongue. The hotel room was too clean for what my body remembered. I sat up carefully, pressing my palm against the bandage the paramedics had wrapped, and scrolled through messages. Alicia. 5 texts in a row. My supervisor. Phone numbers I didn't recognize. My mother's voice on voicemail. Breaking in the middle of my name, Samantha. I saw, "Call me." I stared at the wall while her words bled through the speaker and into my chest. And something in me trembled that had nothing to do with pain. I turned on the television because that's what you do when you're not sure how real the world is. The screen erupted with the kind of banner usually reserved for elections or hurricanes breaking news. A split screen of the resort gardens and a police captain speaking at a podium. Grainy footage followed somebody's phone catching the moment the lights flickered. The angle tilting in chaos as a gunshot snapped the afternoon in two. Then came stills from security cameras I hadn't known existed. The lens catching a blur that became me. My hand seizing the leader's wrist. The arc of a gun leaving his palm. The anchor's voice smoothed everything into a narrative. An attempted armed robbery thwarted by a wedding guest. An Army veteran. Now, a senior security professional. They said my name, the way news says names when it wants the audience to admire and keep watching. I turned the volume down until their mouths moved in silence, and watched the captions walk across the bottom edge of my life. You would think the feeling would be triumph, some perfect neatness where humiliation transforms into vindication overnight. But the truth was quieter and stranger. You felt hollowed out, like a bell after it's been struck. The sound still ringing, but the metal shaken. I sat in the armchair by the window, fingers worrying the edge of the bandage, and let the ocean's horizon steady me. The tide moved in its ancient rhythm, entirely indifferent to whatever story humans made of yesterday. Practicality pulled me forward. I showered carefully, keeping my arm dry, ignoring the soreness when I reached for the towel. The only outfit that made sense was the black pantsuit that felt like armor. In the mirror, I looked like a version of myself I had always believed in, but rarely saw reflected back at me, tired and clear-eyed. Not asking permission. When I stepped into the hallway, I could already hear the murmurs from the brunch down the corridor. The gathered voices of people who had never said my name out loud before last night. Inside the smaller reception room, the atmosphere was hushed and brittle, as if too much sudden honesty had cracked the air. There were plates of food arranged with artistry that suddenly felt obscene. People hovered in clusters, their sentences ending in the same word, unbelievable. Eleanor saw me first. The polish was softened by something human. Her eyes rimmed with that blue that follows crying. She touched my uninjured wrist lightly, as if asking before assuming. "How is your arm?" she asked. "It will heal," I said, because it would, and because I didn't know how to speak into the silences between us. "The detectives would like to talk to you," she added. "And Richard will, too." She said his name like a fragile object, you're careful not to drop. The detectives were efficient in the way of people accustomed to collecting chaos and flattening it into forms. They asked me to step into a private room. We sat at a table that still smelled of polish, and I walked them through the moments as plainly as I could, the ill-fitting uniforms, the scanning eyes, the storage room whispers, the decision tree that had narrowed into one clear branch when a gun pressed into my father's temple. They told me the crew was part of a ring that had hit other events. That evidence found in a van matched stolen items from previous robberies. They told me I might be called to testify. They told me commendation like it was a word you could put the whole night inside and then file. When I returned to the brunch, something in the room had shifted without me. A television mounted above the bar had been turned up. and I entered to my own name in the mouth of a stranger. My company had released a statement. There was my photo from the firm's website. Professional and unbloodied. The anchor said rising star and courage under pressure in international summit. And I watched the way sentences can stitch a life into a shape you don't entirely recognize. The camera cut to a short interview with a guest from the wedding, who said I moved like a movie, like something not wholly real. Then the feed returned to the garden footage. And that was when I heard it, the small, precise shatter of crystal against tile. I turned to see my father staring at the television, champagne dripping from his fingers into a glittering ruin at his feet. It is hard to describe the expression on a man's face when a story he has told about his daughter for years burns up in the air between them. Shock is too clean a word. Shame is too simple. He looked, disassembled. As applause began around me like a tide that couldn't decide if it was coming in or going out, he did not clap. He stood very still, as if movement might make the new truth permanent. I felt a tangle of things rise in my chest, vindication sharp as citrus, grief heavy as wet cloth, a tenderness I didn't want that said he's human. And humans fail. And sometimes they learn. I did not trust any of those feelings. So I did not act on them. I took a breath and let the moment choose me. People turned then. The same faces that had slid past me last night reoriented like sunflowers toward a window of light. Is that really you, my God? You were incredible. What tipped you off? Each question was a small pulling at the thread of me, and I answered without offering more than the truth required. Training, patterns, timing. I spoke about the difference between panic and purpose and how to keep the body moving when fear wants to make a home of your knees. They drank the words like a second round of mimosas. It felt unreal to be the center of the room after years of being placed at its edge. A staff member appeared, breathless, to say the detectives were ready to release updates, that all 7 suspects were booked, that the DA would likely pursue maximum charges. Someone joked too loudly about insurance. Someone else whispered, hero like a word you tiptoe around. I was trying to plot a quiet path to the exit when my father finally crossed the space between us. He didn't reach for me at first. He just stopped in front of me and tried to put a sentence in order. The police, he began, and faltered. He swallowed and started again. The police said you saved lives. He didn't say our lives, but it was in the way his eyes flicked briefly, involuntarily, to the bandage on my arm. He felt suddenly, absurdly, like laughing. The part of me that had waited years for a clean apology stood up inside me, and the part that had learned to live without one gently suggested a chair. I did my job, I said, and I let the words be both humble and defiant. Would you talk with me? He asked. Privately. I nodded because some conversations are better without an audience, and because the child inside me still wanted this not to be theater. He texted me a location, the quiet bar on the top floor that overlooks the ocean, and I told him I'd meet him after I gave the detectives what they needed. As I turned to go, my phone rang with my supervisor's name. Are you all right? He asked when I answered. The question both human and corporate. He told me the company was proud, that the CEO wanted to meet, that I should expect new responsibilities. He said promotion in the tentative way men do when they are waiting to see if a woman will accept good news as her due. I told him I'd be back in the city soon, that my arm would heal, that I wasn't interested in media. He said, of course. Of course. We'll handle it. And I believed him, because for once the world seemed briefly inclined toward sense. The top floor bar was nearly empty that afternoon, the windows holding the ocean like a painting. My father was already there. His posture knocked slightly out of true. 2 glasses sat on the table club soda with lime, and something amber he hadn't touched. You don't drink when you're on duty, he said. And I wondered how long he'd been storing that small fact, like a coin in a drawer he rarely opened. I sat across from him, and the silence, for once, was not an indictment. It was a space where a thing might be built. He said he'd watched more coverage. He said the experts used words that made him feel both proud and stupid. Threat assessment, Minimal force intervention. Situational command. He said it felt like hearing about a stranger until he realized the stranger was the person I had been telling him I was for years. He did not rush toward absolution. He did not pretend this was only about last night. I have been, he said, staring at his hands. Wrong in the loud way that looks like certainty. The sentence was not elegant, but it was closer to the truth than anything he'd said to me in years. I told him what I needed to tell him, that his dismissals had felt like erasure, that each just a security guard had carried the weight of an entire childhood of being measured against a set of expectations that were never mine. That respect cannot be retroactive and still heal completely. He nodded, like a student who understands the theory even if the practice will take time. I thought I was protecting your future, he said softly. I thought money and prestige were the safest places to keep a life. Yesterday, when a gun was at my head, I realized how stupid that sounds out loud. He lifted his eyes then, and there was something in them I had rarely seen directed at me: humility. The kind that isn't a performance, but a door that's been unlocked from the inside. He said he wanted to start again. Not like a man offering to rewrite the past, but like someone proffering a new blank page with both hands. He did not ask forgiveness as a shortcut. He offered curiosity. Tell me what your days look like, he said. Tell me what you notice first when you enter a room. Tell me why you chose this and what you love about it. So I told him about the calm click in my body when I am doing exactly what I am built for, about reading a space the way some people read faces, about the quiet ecstasy of protecting strangers who never know your name. He listened the way people look at art they can't afford and finally understand, mouth slightly open, eyes softened by the surrender of their pretense. When we stood to leave, the ocean had moved its blue a few inches closer to the shore. He hesitated, as if asking permission to be something other than the man he'd been. Thank you, he said at the door. And this time I believed him. Not for the show of it. Not because people were watching, but because the word fit gratitude as recognition, not debt. I walked back through the lobby as sunlight slanted across the marble, and the day began to taste like evening. People glanced up from their phones as I passed, then back down again, their lives already tugging them onward. In the elevator, alone with the mirrored version of myself, I touched the edge of my bandage and thought of the younger me sitting at my mother's kitchen table, filling out enlistment forms with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I wanted to send her a message through time. You will become exactly who you are trying to be. The noise around you will not define you. The loudest story in the room will not be the truest one. Outside, gulls stitched small white punctuation marks into the sky. The garden crew was clearing shards of glass and writing chairs, resetting a landscape that had been briefly rearranged by violence. I thought of how many times we do that with our lives: gather the fragments, steady the furniture of our days, choose where to put the next vase of flowers. I tightened the strap of my bag on my shoulder and felt, underneath the ache, a clean thread of something that surprised me. Not triumph. Not even relief. Something steadier: alignment. The sense of a life clicking into itself. Audible at last. The following weeks blurred together in the way trauma often does, sharp edges softened by repetition. The same questions asked by different voices until the story became something rehearsed. I gave statements, filled out reports, nodded through interviews that wanted heroism, when all I could offer was the truth. I did what I was trained to do. I went home to my apartment, where the quiet was a living thing. The bandage on my arm grew smaller every day until only the scar remained, pale and raised, a whisper of metal and chance. I learned that fame, even accidental, has its own gravity. There were requests for appearances, podcasts, panels about women in security. I declined most of them. My inbox filled with strangers thanking me for proving something about bravery that they needed to believe. I read their messages at night and tried to feel what they felt. But the world still tilted at odd angles. Courage looks different from the inside. It feels more like maintenance than glory. More like staying upright when the floor moves. My mother visited after the first week. She hugged me too tightly and scolded me for getting shot. Then she made tea, the same way she always had. And we sat on my sofa watching the evening light crawl across the walls. She didn't ask about my father until the second cup. "Have you talked to him?" she said. "Once." I admitted. "It was civil." She smiled faintly. "That's more than I expected." There was no bitterness in her tone. Just a measured understanding that some wounds are inherited, like eye color. Work became a refuge again. The company reassigned me to headquarters, citing both recognition and strategic utilization of expertise. It was a promotion in every way that counts salary. Team. Respect. I ran crisis simulations, trained new recruits, rewrote outdated safety protocols. My days filled with structure. But under the rhythm of meetings and drills, there was always that quiet hum, the part of me that had seen my father's face under a gun and realized how fragile disdain really is. He called occasionally. Short conversations. Cautious as diplomacy. "How's the arm?" "Fine." "Busy week always." Once, unexpectedly, he asked about my mother. I told him she was teaching. "Happy," he said. "Good." And it sounded like he meant it. We were learning the slow art of civility, one syllable at a time. Then came the article, a glossy magazine piece titled "The Hero in Plain Clothes." They had interviewed witnesses, colleagues, even my commanding officer from the army. The writer described me as calm under fire, fearless, emblematic. He skimmed it, half embarrassed, until the final paragraph stopped me cold. Her father, prominent businessman Richard Williams, declined to comment but released a statement, calling his daughter the bravest person I know. I read it twice. The words were small, almost formal, but something inside them loosened a knot I hadn't realized was still there. For years I'd imagined the apology I wanted from him grand, cinematic, impossible. This wasn't that. It was just ink on a page. But it was real. A week later, he invited me to lunch. Not at the country club or some sterile restaurant, but a small diner near the waterfront. The kind of place with cracked leather booths and coffee that tastes like honesty. When I walked in, he was already there. Sleeves rolled up, a newspaper folded beside his plate. He stood when he saw me awkwardly, as if testing a muscle he hadn't used in years. "I didn't know what you like to eat," he said, so I ordered pancakes. It was the simplest meal we had shared since I was a child. He asked about my work without condescension. He listened. When the waitress poured more coffee, he hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking about what matters, about what kind of father I want to be, in whatever time I have left to try again." I watched him search for the right words and fail and try again. "I can't change what I did, or what I didn't do," he said finally, "but I'd like to learn who you are now, if you'll let me." The forgiveness that followed wasn't cinematic either. It was quiet, awkward, incremental, a rebuilding measured in text messages, in dinners that didn't end with arguments, in the way he began introducing me as my daughter, the one who saved us all. I never corrected him, even though the saving had been mutual. Months later, when the trial ended and the last of the robbers were sentenced, he called me again. "I wanted to be there," he said. "I couldn't. You didn't need to." I told him, "It's done." He paused. "Are you?" I thought about that. The answer was both yes and no. Healing isn't a door you walk through. It's a corridor you learn to navigate in better light. That summer, he invited me to his house for the first time in years. Not the mansion I remembered he'd sold that, but a smaller home with creaking floors and a garden that smelled of earth instead of money. I met Eleanor again. She was gentler now, her laugh less brittle. We ate outdoors under a string of lights, the air humming with crickets. When I got up to leave, he handed me a small velvet box. Inside was a thin silver bracelet engraved with 3 words, "You are enough." I wore it for a long time. Not because I needed the reminder, but because sometimes healing leaves room for tenderness. And I was learning not to flinch from it. Now, years later, when people recognize me from that old story and ask what it felt like to be a hero, I tell them it didn't feel like that at all. It felt like finally being seen, and realizing I no longer needed to be. If this story found its way to you, maybe you've lived some version of it trying to earn love that should have been given freely, waiting for words that never came, finding strength in the silence left behind. If you have, I hope you know this: your worth isn't measured by who applauds when you succeed. It's measured by the quiet courage it takes to keep becoming yourself, even when no one is watching. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Tell me in the comments what redemption means to you. Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is forgive ourselves first.